In 1994, after 30 years living in England, I went back to South Africa for a very exciting event, which was the first free democratic elections. And I joined the queues of a multitude of people who were absolutely joyful and celebratory at being able to cast a vote for the very first time in their lives on an equal basis, one person, one vote. And I'm going to tell you the story tonight of the journey that I travelled, that my family travelled, and that the people of South Africa travelled to get to that point. My parents played a very small part in what was a very big political drama, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of my own personal memories and some of theirs, and their memoirs which they wrote. They both wrote a book. So that's my mum and dad taking part in the vote in the elections, and my dad wrote a memoir, Memory Against Forgetting. My mum wrote a book called The World That Was Ours. And you'll hear readings from both of those books tonight. And my dad said in his that he hoped to shed light on some times which he thought otherwise would be beyond the understanding of generations who didn't live through them. And I'm hoping maybe to do something of that tonight. I was born in 1951, right in the middle of the century in which apartheid was born and it died. And I was born in Johannesburg. This was the house of my childhood, where I lived with my family, my two brothers, sister, my mum and dad. My dad's absent from the photo, and he was often absent from our lives. We had a very good life there, a typical white South African life. We had a swimming pool at the back of our garden, we had fruit trees, we went on lovely summer holidays to the beach, Cape Town, Durban, Plettenberg Bay. We played sports, we went to good schools. All in all, as a white South African, it was a jolly good life. But life in South Africa at that time was definitely a life of two sides, black and white, because of the system of apartheid under which I was brought up. And purely by accident of birth, I had a white skin. If I'd had a black skin, I would have probably lived somewhere more like this, typical living accommodation of the black population outside of the cities in shanty towns. Throughout my childhood, these kind of signs were commonplace. Whites-only toilets, whites-only public swimming pools, places where I swam, black children could only gaze longingly through the fences. The hospitals, whites only, even the beach and sea, where I was able to have fantastic holidays, was reserved for whites only. And you can see from the sign up there something of the attitude that underpinned apartheid. Of Caution, beware of natives. Natives was a term for black Africans, something to be feared, people not quite like us, people of inferior status. These are some of the horrible, brutal statistics of what apartheid life meant for black South Africans. Most people didn't have the vote. Children, if they were lucky, went to school. Majority didn't. Many didn't go to school, and the facilities very poor. Medical facilities, every aspect of life was governed by the colour of your skin. The country itself was divided up. The land was allocated on the basis of race. So you can see the big yellow area was reserved for whites, who were 10% of the population, and the various other black communities were divided up under spurious bases into so-called tribal homeland areas, which are the little coloured areas dotted about in the most infertile and arid parts of the country. It was in one of these areas, the Ciskei, little pink area down the bottom, that lived a teacher called Mxolisi Machila. He taught in a school that would have looked much like this, a typical school in the Ciskei homeland area. He was a thorn in the side of the apartheid authorities. He spoke out about injustice, and the school inspectors didn't take kindly to that, and one day they came into school to give him his letter of dismissal. Now, he happened to be a trained composer, one of the few black people to have been able to get a musical education, and he went with his children in the classroom and started to write a song. And they sang the song. The story goes that teachers and children were so moved that it brought tears to people's eyes. And the song says, "What have I done? On this earth we carry a heavy burden. Let this be over." And that's what we're going to sing for you now.
Tate motivo yo matla, redireleng molifaseng, redireleng molifaseng. Tate motivo yo matla, tate motivo yo matla, redireleng
Thank you. So my life was quite normal in some ways, normal white South African life. In other ways it was quite unusual because my parents were both political activists, starting in the 1930s when they joined the Labour League of Youth, and then when they joined the Communist Party, because it was the only party in South Africa that wasn't segregated. It was the only place where black and white could meet together to campaign. Just before I was born, 1948, was quite a crucial time in South Africa because the nationalist government came to power. That was the right-wing Afrikaner Party who won the elections in 1948. And at the same time, the African National Congress, which had been in existence since 1912 actually, because some of the discrimination started way back. But at this point in time, a new and radical young leadership came into the African National Congress. And it was these new young leaders that took it in a new direction. And it was through the collaboration between the African National Congress and the Communist Party that my parents first met Nelson Mandela and the other leaders of the ANC. And you'll see there two of the others, Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, who were very key people at that time. And my father writes that the interconnection of these three great men shaped our history through the decades of struggle which led to the new South Africa. Meeting them literally changed my life. All in all, it was the greatest privilege of my life to have been involved with and to have worked with extraordinary men like these, to have been friends with and to have been befriended by them. And he also said that extra-parliamentary politics didn't bring many rewards, but this was one of the greatest rewards of it for him. So in the 1950s was a period of a renewed mass direct action on a scale not really seen before. And I'm going to just describe one of the campaigns that took place in that period. There were many protests, demonstrations and campaigns. This is one that my dad was involved in. It was called Let Us Speak of Freedom. So black people had no voice, they had no means of expressing their aspirations, other than through song. I didn't mention that the reason why we're telling the story with songs is because that was one of the most vital means of expression that black people did have. They organised a campaign. They recruited thousands of volunteers to go out to hold meetings throughout the country and ask people what they would like to see in a free and fair South Africa. And they held meetings throughout the country. People sent their demands back, and Jill's going to read to you an extract from my father's book where he describes his role in trying to put all these demands together.
Most of the demands were one-liners, dealing with a single issue of daily life: homes, jobs, living standards and civil liberties. They wrote their summaries on scraps of paper, backs of envelopes, pages torn from old exercise books, and often the backs of our own handbills. With a team of volunteers, we sorted thousands of the individual written demands into topics, until an entire living room floor had been covered with mounds of paper. I started to outline a skeleton charter.
My dad was one of the people who drafted those demands into the Freedom Charter, which became the expression of the broad aspirations of people for a fairer society, and which remains popular in South Africa today. So the Freedom Charter was then put to the people. They called a Congress of Delegates, called the Congress of the People. Delegates came from far and wide. So delegates gathered from across the country with their demands. You can see a delegation of Indian women, of women from rural areas, men, women, people of all races gathered to decide whether to sign up to the Freedom Charter.
This is the message of the Freedom Charter. Forward we shall march to the people's government. The land must be shared among those who work it. Forward we shall march to the people's government.
Open the doors.
Open the door.
Open the doors.
Of learning and culture. Forward we shall march to the people's government. Forward we shall march. Forward we shall march. Forward we shall march to the people's government.
The government's response was to round up 156 people who they considered leaders of this seditious activity and to charge them with treason. And there was a famous trial called the Treason Trial. You see my dad right at the bottom, with his hands on his knees, somewhere in the middle there. They were all charged with the fact that the Congress of the People and the Freedom Charter were steps to establish a communist state and a violent revolution. The prisoners obviously were segregated, but all the black prisoners, when I say black I mean black African, Indian, all the different black prisoners were kept together. And Nelson Mandela called it the longest and largest unbanned meeting that they'd ever held, because it was already very difficult to have meetings. During the time of the treason trial, my younger brother Keith was born, and my mother tells this story of going to visit my dad in prison. The prisoners were all lined up behind grills over there, then there was a big gap, and all the wives and relations were lined up behind another grill over here. And my dad shouted over, "What's the baby called?" My mum shouted back, "You said to call the baby Keith." Somebody down the line, my dad said, "I didn't say to call the baby Keith." And somebody else down the line said, "I said to call the baby Keith." The trial dragged on for 3 miserable, boring years. They didn't keep them all in prison all that time, but at the end of it, a Liberal judge, Judge Becker, found them all not guilty. During that time, other activities were fermenting. My mother was involved with the formation of the Federation of South African Women, and they organised a huge march of 20,000 women to present a petition to the government in Pretoria against the pass laws. I'll just tell you a very little bit about the pass laws. If you're wondering, well, how did the government exert control over people to force them to live in these areas and not in those areas, and to work in these jobs and not in those jobs? Well, one of the main means of enforcing it was through the pass. The pass was an identification booklet like that, which every black male over the age of 18 had to carry with him at all times. And it gave you permission for where you could be at any time of day or night, where you could live, where you could work. And the police frequently stopped people to check their passbooks, and if they were out of order, they were arrested. And if I tell you that in the 25 years after I was born, 11 million people were imprisoned for not having the correct papers. That's why the pass laws were so hated. The courts would hear between 300 and 400 cases in a morning. They would be given a minute each, summary justice, and then sent to prison. So the women were marching because the government wanted to extend the pass laws to women. In 1960, there was another peaceful demonstration against the pass laws at a place called Sharpeville. And at that demonstration, the police opened fire. And Dick's going to read you an extract from my mother's book, where she describes what happened there.
When the shooting finally dies away, there are 69 men, women and children lying dead, strewn across the dusty veldt where they fled. Almost all of these have been shot from behind. Hundreds more are wounded and bleeding, struggling desperately to drag themselves away. It's one of the worst massacres in South African history, but no one will ever be held accountable.
Indeed, nobody could be held accountable because the government passed a law straight afterwards, the Indemnity Act, indemnifying themselves against any accusations of wrongdoing. Well, protests led to killings, killings led to funerals, funerals themselves became protests, and often more people were killed, and a cycle of protest, killing and protest was in action. And this song we're going to sing now is one that was frequently sung at funerals. Senzeni now. The government's response, yet again, to the protests at Sharpeville and the outcry about the killings was to declare a state of emergency in the country and to round up 18,000 people and put them in prison. They banned the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress. The Communist Party had already been banned prior to that. And as far as my family were concerned, both my mum and my dad were amongst those 18,000 who were arrested. So we as children, I would have been 9 at the time, were farmed out to friends and relatives. At that point, the movement took a decisive turn. Mandela said, "If the government's reaction is to crush by naked force our non-violent demonstrations, we will have to seriously reconsider our tactics. In my mind, we are closing a chapter on the question of non-violent policy." So in 1961, they took a decision to start in a limited scale of an armed struggle. They formed an organisation called Mkonto Wesizwe, and they began some quite amateurish and rudimentary acts of sabotage against government installations. At the same time, the government's clamping down on activists got even more severe. Anybody who was active was subject to many, many banning orders and restrictions, as well as the arrests. So my dad, when he was released after the state of emergency, was put under house arrest. He was under 12-hour house arrest. Some people were put under 24-hour house arrest. He was lucky he could leave the house during the day and at weekends. Sorry, not at weekends. He could only leave the house during the day, during the week. He also had to report to the police every day. He had various other banning restrictions. He couldn't receive guests at home. That meant, could we children have guests? Would they be considered his guests? He wasn't allowed to communicate with any other banned person. My mother was another banned person. But they did give special dispensation for husbands and wives to communicate. It was a minefield. My dad said there was danger everywhere, even inside our own home. Life had become like an expedition through a minefield. They didn't know what constituted a gathering. Would 2 people at a bus stop, if they happened to be friends, constitute a gathering? What constituted communicating with a banned person if somebody rang you up and you replied to the phone call? And in order to, obviously, to police all these banning orders, the house was under police surveillance, the phone was tapped. We had an old bathtub in the back garden of our house, and that was where they burnt literature, publications, newspapers, pamphlets of organisations that had become banned, because any of that would be an arrestable offence. The police would make raids in the middle of the night on the house to see if you had any banned literature, always in the middle of the night. Well, at that time, my dad being under house arrest had one advantage for me, which was that previously he'd always been out at meetings in the evening, and now he was always home in the evening, and he could read me a story before I went to bed. So for me it was a slightly more secure time. However, it did mean that my mother anxiously every evening at 6 o'clock would look at her watch to make sure my dad was home before his curfew time. And many a time he'd be a bit late and she'd say, cutting it a bit fine tonight, weren't we? And she'd be really secretly inside very worried. So July the 11th, 1963 was the night where everything really changed for us. Because that night it got to 6 o'clock and my dad didn't come home. And it got to 7 o'clock and he didn't come home. And he didn't come home that night at all. And the next morning I remember seeing my mum in the kitchen looking quite haggard and drawn and as if she hadn't really slept, and she was anxiously looking through the newspaper to see if there was any news of what she suspected would have happened, because my dad had actually gone out that evening to a secret meeting in what we thought was a safe secret house where the leaders of the ANC were meeting. And in fact later that day it emerged that the police had stumbled upon this secret house and had arrested all the men who were there, and along with a very incriminating document, a document called Operation Maibuye. And it was a document in which they were discussing, the leadership were discussing whether to take the armed struggle to a new phase, to actually start training people in military struggle and start a military stage of the liberation struggle. So the men arrested there were initially held under what was called the 90-day law, that was a law whereby you could be held for 90 days without charge, without access to a lawyer, without access to writing or reading materials or visitors. In fact, a form of torture, really, confined to your cell for 23 hours a day without contact with the outside world. During that time, my mum and dad tried to find a way to communicate. So the prisoners were allowed to send dirty washing home, and the families were allowed to bring food parcels in to the prison. So my mum hit upon this idea, which was she took the inside out of a pen and she hid it inside a banana. She pushed it down inside the middle of a banana. Because although boxes of cornflakes or biscuits would be opened up and the warders would look for things being smuggled, they wouldn't look inside a banana. And also my dad hated bananas, so she knew that he would know there was something there for him. So she smuggled the pen in, and he in turn tore up bits of handkerchief and wrote in incredibly small writing and smuggled letters out. And yeah, those are actual copies of the letters, of some of the letters, which are now in an archive in South Africa. And he smuggled them out by rolling them up extremely small and sticking them inside. Men's shirts used to have a bone, a hole for a bone in the collar, and put them inside the hole. And when the dirty washing came home, I can remember my mum standing by the window, holding each piece of washing up to the light to look for something. She knew he would try and communicate somehow. She didn't know how, and eventually she found the letters. And Stephen's going to read an extract from one of these letters.
I feel as though here I am down amongst the dead, the walking dead. But really, my main feeling here is a vast love for you and the children, which is slowly breaking my heart because of a tremendous sorrow for the awful mess I have made of your lives. There should be heroic and noble thoughts in a time like this to sustain me, but there are not. Just a great pitying for the utter mess I have made of life, with little to look back on, except the knowledge that I have lived my life with some measure of integrity to my own principles and beliefs. Sometimes, when I look at this mess and wonder what I would do if I had my time over, I still think I would tread much the same path again.
Well, after the 90 days incarceration was over, the men were brought together and tried, and they were tried with the hundreds of charges of planning sabotage, of planning guerrilla warfare, of planning military revolution. Terribly serious charges, really, which together would readily attract the death penalty. I can remember becoming aware of this at some point during the trial and saying to my mum, "They won't hang them, will they?" And she said, "No, no." But I wasn't entirely convinced by her answer. Well, at the end of the trial, Mandela made a famous speech from the dock, which you're going to hear, and the recording is actually a contemporary recording made in the court at the time. And after you hear Mandela, you'll see an interview with my dad, which was recorded by a TV programme some years later, talking about that moment in the court where Mandela made his famous speech.
Africans want to be paid a living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing. We want to be allowed to live where we obtain work and not be endorsed out of an area because we were not born there. We want to be allowed to travel in our own country and to seek work where we want to, and not where the Labour Bureau tells us to. We want a just share in the whole of South Africa. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The effect was absolutely electric in the court. I mean, there was that sort of hushed silence in which you had the feeling everybody had stopped breathing. Because I think everybody recognized that in a way this was a man taking his life in his hands and saying, here, shoot me if you want to. And it really had a completely electric effect on the court, and there was dead silence as he sat down for quite a long time. And then, of course, the excitement broke and the public all started talking and so on, and there was some pandemonium. But for the moment, it was really one of the most dramatic moments I've ever experienced in my life.
Well, my mum was in court the day that they pronounced the verdict, and that's a newspaper cutting from the time. All the men were found guilty, apart from my dad. You'll see there that Bernstein freed, that was my dad, and then rearrested. As he made to leave the dock and join the relatives, policeman put his hand on my dad's shoulder and said, Mr. Bernstein, you're under arrest. So although he'd been found not guilty, they were going to prepare new charges for him. And the following day, the sentence was going to be given, so a very tense moment. There were two white men on trial, that was my dad and Dennis Goldberg, and my mum was in court on the day that sentence was given with Dennis Goldberg's mum, Annie. And Paul's going to read about that moment in court when the sentence was given.
It's over. But we haven't properly heard. Annie has hardly heard a word, and I've only just caught some phrases. The function of the court not to impose the supreme penalty. We stand together in an agony of uncertainty and indecision. We turn to people around us and we hear someone say life. But life for whom? The men turn for the last time to smile at their wives and relatives, but the police are already pushing them down to the cells below. As they move forward, Annie cries out in desperation, "Dennis! Dennis! What is it?" And Dennis turns and, spreading both arms in a gesture almost joyful, answers loudly, "Life! Life! To live!" And then they're gone. Outside, the crowd waits silently until Winnie Mandela walks down the steps and with arm raised in salute calls to them, "Life!" And then the crowd burst out singing and unfurl banners which they've been hiding from the police. The banners read, "You will not serve your sentences as long as we shall live. Sentence or no sentence, we stand by our leaders. We are proud of our leaders." And Church Square echoes to the slow-moving harmony.
He's locked up.
He's locked up, sent to Robben Island. We shall never sorrow. Power to the people.
He's locked up.
He's locked up, sent to Robben Island. We shall never sorrow. Power to the people.
Bantata.
Bantata, Bambekae Island, Wasuka Wakala, Watiamanga.
Bantata.
Bantata, Bambekae Island, Wasuka Wakala, Watiamanga.
Katete.
Kautete, Teta Winnie. freedom to our land.
Speak out loud.
Speak out loud. Speak out, Winnie. Speak out to the people. Freedom to our land.
So the men, apart from Dennis Goldberg, the white man, he was sent to a white prison, the rest were sent to Robben Island to serve their life sentences. And my dad was released on bail, and for a few happy weeks he was home with us again. It didn't last terribly long, and it was a difficult time because at that time my mum was in hiding, sometimes at home, sometimes not at home, because the police were looking for her as well. So they took a very difficult decision. I came out of school one afternoon, and a family friend met me and took me to the park. He said, "There's some people waiting there for you." And I approached a bench with two people on who I didn't really recognise at first. When I got nearer, I realised it was my mum and dad. They were in disguise. They were going to set off that night on a difficult and dangerous journey to try and leave South Africa without the police discovering them. So they said goodbye and said they would send for us all when they got to safety. And they found a man called Mr. McClipper who was going to drive them towards the border. So in their disguises and crouching down inside the car, Mr. McClipper drove them. And Alison's going to read you an extract from my mum's book, describing a bit of that journey.
Now we must walk, says McClipper, midnight, about 7 miles to the border, at least 2 hours of walking. And when we reach the border, another 3 or 4 miles. It is a night of absolute darkness, completely without sound, no moon, and few stars. We walk in the blackness and silence over level ground, through rough grass and among small twisted trees. After an hour of steady walking, McClipper says we've reached the point where he will turn back. As we stand with him, far and faint are cock crows in the darkness. Then another. McClipper says solemnly, "You hear that cock crow over there?" "Yes." "And that one over there?" "Yes." "If you follow a line that runs between those two cock crows, you'll be going the right way." How do you walk between the remembered sound of cock crows?
Well, they stumbled through the darkness and the bush, and eventually they did manage to cross the border, and they did get to safety. And when they had arrived in safety, we were besieged with press interest, and our lives then took another dramatic turn. We all joined my parents eventually in England and in safety. And from there we grew up and led ordinary and safe and secure lives, watching the events in South Africa from afar. The situation in South Africa wasn't good after the Rivonia trial because it sort of decapitated the movement. So for a while things went quiet. But in the 1970s, new generations of students and workers started to fight back again. In 1976, there was a march of school students in Soweto. 20,000 gathered to protest against the government imposing Afrikaans as the medium of instruction in schools instead of English. And 176 were shot dead. That's Hector Peterson, the first young boy of 13 to be killed by the police for demonstrating against Afrikaans. By the end of the year, more demonstrations, more killings. 600 young people had been killed. Repression and violence only inflamed more resistance. The police killed Stephen Biko. 80,000 people came out to attend his funeral. And at these really difficult times, songs helped to maintain people's spirits. Bishop Tutu said, "Sometimes the singing was very bloody and belligerent, but it was a way of people letting off steam, like a valve, enabling them to release some of the anguish and built-up anger that they had." In some violence-torn areas, if it wasn't for the songs, the communities would have been very demoralised, given in to the enemy, but the songs make them feel we're going to survive and kept the spirit of no surrender going. And this is one of those songs.
Hey, ta ta, ta ta ta, hey, ta ta, ta ta, hey, ta ta, ta ta. Come up and dooley, I wonder. Come up and dooley, I wonder. Dolo pizulo, pesulo, dolo pizulo, pesulo, dolo pizulo, pesulo, dolo pizulo, pesulo. Hey, ta ta, ta ta, hey, ta ta, ta ta. Pakwabeleni, Zanda. Pakwabeleni, Zanda. Pakwabeleni, Zanda. Hey, ta ta, ta, hey, ta ta, ta. Shona malanga, shona, shona malanga, shona malanga, shona, shona. Divana, divana, divana. Shona malanga, shona, shona malanga, shona malanga, shona malanga, shona malanga, shona malanga, shona. Preciso divana, divana, divana. Oh.
The 1980s, again, increased militancy, increased repression. The government's assassinations, war on the frontline states, Tanzania, Zimbabwe and Namibia, mass workers and students' movements, COSATU, the UDF, and in other countries, the anti-apartheid movement, campaigning for sports boycotts, consumer boycotts, disinvestment from South Africa, and a focus on releasing Nelson Mandela. In addition, Umkhonto we Sizwe were undertaking military operations against the South African regime. And if I tell you that between the 1960s and the 90s, over 500,000 young white men were conscripted into the army, you will understand the pressure the South African regime was under. This song is a song of Umkhonto we Sizwe. It's a song about the armed struggle and praising the soldiers for bringing liberation to people.
Umkhonto libutho lamengi lithandayo. Umkhonto libutho lithandayo. Umkhonto libutho lamengi lithandayo. Umkhonto libutho lithandayo. Umkhonto libutho lamengi lithandayo. Ukwezi lelimoto, ukanda wamato, umwela Umkhonto
Proved to be too much, and in 1989 secret discussions were started with Mandela, resulting in 1990 of the joyous day when he was released and all the banned organisations were unbanned and people could return. Many, of course, had put down roots elsewhere after so many long years and didn't return, others did. There was quite a difficult period between his release and the elections in 1994. We often remember Mandela for bringing about a peaceful resolution to the conflict, but there was a huge amount of violence and over 10,000 black people killed during that period leading up to the elections. And so my story has come full circle. Now you can understand why our journey back to vote was so momentous for us personally and for the world generally and for South Africans generally. My parents felt they were part of the luckiest generation to have seen the thing that they fought for come to fruition. And apartheid was buried. As we know now, the result of the election was that Mandela was elected president. And we're going to sing you a song which was sung at his inauguration. And we'd welcome you joining in. The words will be up there. It's quite repetitive, and you'll soon get the hang.
Nelson Mandela. Mandela. Nelson Mandela.
Usele tela ukolo Nelson Mandela Mandela Usile tela ukolo Nelson Mandela Mandela Usile tela ukolo Nelson Mandela Mandela Nelson Mandela Usile tela ukolo Nelson Mandela Mandela Usile
achievement, but not the end of the struggle. Things in South Africa are still not as good as they should be, and more battles remain to be fought. My mother, who was a wise woman, said that. So perhaps we're waiting for a new generation to carry on the fight that was fought. That's where our story ends. We may just have time for a few questions, if there are any, before we sing you out with the national anthem.
Why did your parents leave? Was it for the sake of the children?
Yeah, it was really. It was a very tortured decision because obviously they were leaving comrades behind in prison. Other people who, like them, would have been facing arrest, the possibility of arrest, but didn't decide to leave. But I think, you know, from my father's letter that was read to you, he felt intensely that he didn't want to put the children under any more pressure and didn't want to be separated from the children, and I think that was the crux of the decision. People were faced with those really, really difficult, impossible decisions.
To which country did they go?
Well, initially they crossed the border into Botswana, which was then Bechuanaland, then to Tanzania, and eventually to England. They did want to go back and live in Zambia, but they couldn't get permission, so we settled in England, and England has been a very good country, very good to all of us. I'll just take one more question, and then I think we have to wind up. I'm being told in the wings. I'm sorry.
Not a question, it's just to say thank you, Francis. I was privileged to take part in those elections, and your mother's book was one of the first anti-apartheid books I ever read.
Oh, that's nice to hear, thank you. Well, perhaps you'd like to stand while we sing the national anthem and join in if you can.
Così Ilkley, Africa, malupakani suponowayo, Israel mitanda zoyetu, Così Ilkley, tina lusapolwayo, Così Ilkley, Africa, malupakani suponowayo, Israel mitanda zoyetu, Così Ilkley, tina lusapolwayo. Morena boluca se chaba sa Jesu, ofendi se titwale